My brother PRICD, my inheritance $800. He didn't know I'm a certified appraiser. I spent 30 years telling strangers what their grandmother's furniture was actually worth. When my own father died, my brother priced me at zero. 4 days, that's what I had to save $214,000 from being sold out from under me for 800 and called it fair. My father, Walter, and I spent most Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for 2 years the same way. I'd pull into his driveway around 11, carry his mail in from the box at the end of the walk because his hip made the trip too long, and sit with him while his coffee went from too hot to just right. Some days that was the whole visit. Some days it turned into 3 hours at the pharmacy, waiting for a prescription that should have taken 20 minutes, or a cardiologist's office with chairs bolted to the floor and a television bolted to the wall playing a cooking show nobody watched. I learned the names of two nurses at that cardiology practice well enough that they started asking about my own life instead of just his numbers. There was a hospital stay that spring, 4 days for pneumonia, and I slept in a vinyl recliner in his room every night because he got confused when he woke up alone in the dark, in a building that wasn't his house, and started trying to get up and go home. Mark visited once on day 2, stayed 90 minutes, and told me on his way out that I looked tired and should get some rest. I didn't know what to do with that except nod. My mother, Alina, had died 9 years before any of this, of a stroke that took less than a day from start to finish, fast enough that none of us had time to argue about who should be doing what. Dad never really adjusted to being the one left. He kept her reading glasses on the nightstand for years. He learned to cook exactly 4 dishes, the same 4 on rotation, and refused offers to teach him a fifth. I'd lost my own husband 6 years before that, so there wasn't anyone waiting on me to get home for dinner most nights, which made it easier to stay the extra hour when Dad wanted company more than he wanted help. I live 40 minutes from that house. My brother Mark lives 2 hours away, and in those 2 years I could count his visits on my hands. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Dad's birthday most years. He called more than he came, and every call ended the same way. Let me know if you need anything. I never called him back to take him up on it because I already knew what the answer would sound like. The Christmas before Dad died, Mark and Renee were supposed to drive in on the 23rd and stay through the 26th. They canceled the morning they were meant to leave, some scheduling conflict at Renee's work that could have waited, and Dad spent Christmas Eve at my house instead. Quiet in a way I chalked up to missing Mom until he said, out of nowhere, over dessert, that he didn't blame anybody for anything and I shouldn't either. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I think I do now. There was one Tuesday, maybe 8 months before the end, when Dad got angry with me for the first time in years. I'd suggested a cleaning service twice a month, nothing invasive, and he told me he wasn't an invalid and he wasn't going to be treated like one in his own house. I let it go. 2 weeks later, he brought it up himself, said maybe twice a month wouldn't hurt, and never once admitted he'd changed his mind. That was Dad. He came around to things sideways, never head on, and you learn to recognize the sideways version as a yes. Nobody in my family ever said out loud that I was the one who'd end up doing this. It just happened that way, the way it happens in a lot of families. I lived closer. I didn't have young kids pulling at me, and my job could bend around a hospital schedule when his couldn't. I didn't resent it, not back then. I loved my father. I would have driven twice as far. What I didn't know yet was that all those Tuesdays and Thursdays weren't going to count for anything when the estate got divided. Time doesn't show up on a will. Mileage doesn't either. Showing up for 2 years isn't a debt someone owes you back. It's just love, right up until somebody else decides to count it. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March in the chair by his bedroom window, the one with the good light he liked for reading. I found him around 9 when he didn't answer the door for our regular visit, and I used my spare key. I called 911 out of some reflex that had nothing to do with what I already knew looking at him. The paramedic who arrived was gentle about it, said it looked peaceful, said that for whatever it's worth, which at the time was nothing and now, some months later, is worth a little more than nothing. I called Mark before I called the funeral home because that's the kind of thing you do first even when your hands won't stop shaking. He didn't say much. I remember him asking if I was okay to drive, which felt like the right question at the time, and looking back like the last purely kind thing he asked me for a while. By the time I got off the phone with the funeral director, Mark and Renee were already 40 minutes from the house. They must have left before I even finished the first call. I remember thinking that was fast and not thinking anything else about it because grief doesn't leave room for suspicion. It should have. The funeral home called me 2 days later about a small envelope of personal effects: the watch he'd worn every day for 30 years, his wedding ring, a folded photo of my mother he'd apparently kept in his shirt pocket without ever mentioning it. I was the one who picked that envelope up alone because Mark and Renee were already back home by then, handling what they called the logistics from a distance. The funeral was Thursday, small, at the church Dad had gone to since before I was born. The kind of service where half the room is people from a bowling league he hadn't bowled with in a decade, and the other half is neighbors who'd watched him mow that same lawn for 40 years. The pastor got a detail wrong, said Dad had served in the Navy when it was the Army, and nobody corrected him because it didn't seem like the moment. A neighbor named Ruth stopped me on the church steps afterward and told me she'd seen my car in Dad's driveway more mornings than she could count over the last 2 years. Said it like she wanted me to know somebody had noticed, even if it hadn't come from inside my own family. I thanked her and didn't trust myself to say much else. Afterward, back at the house, people brought casseroles and stood around, not knowing what to do with their hands, and Renee pulled me into the kitchen while Mark stayed out talking to guests. Family doesn't fight over stuff, she said, low enough that no one else could hear it. Dad would want us all to just get along, so let's keep this simple. No appraisers, no drama, we just divide things up like adults and move on. I'd heard some version of that sentence my whole life, usually right before I was expected to give something up. This time it came with a legal pad already sitting on the counter behind her. 3 columns started in Mark's handwriting. Mark had power of attorney. He'd had it for 2 years, since a health scare of his own around the same time Dad's decline started, back when I was still traveling every other week for work, and a lawyer suggested it made more practical sense for Mark to hold it. Nobody updated it once that stopped being true, once I was the one driving out twice a week and Mark's health scare had resolved into nothing. So legally, on paper, my brother, who visited 4 times a year, had more say over our father's house than I did. He'd already called a company called Rapid Estate Solutions. He'd already picked a date, Saturday, 4 days out. Renee walked through the house that same afternoon with a roll of yellow price stickers, and by evening every item in my father's den had won, including a painting that had hung over his desk since before I was born, priced at $40 in her handwriting, same as the ottoman beside it. A legal pad in a kitchen isn't planning. It's a decision already made, dressed up as a conversation. Let me back up to 2019, because that's where this really starts, 3 years before any of this. I'd driven out to a farmhouse 2 counties over for a routine appraisal job, an estate sale for a family I didn't know, cataloging furniture and dishware for a fee that barely covered the gas money. It was the kind of job I still took even after cutting back, because I liked the work more than I liked the money from it. In the front hallway, there was a landscape painting, a creek at dusk with the light hitting the water at an angle that felt almost too specific to be invented, and it stopped me before I even registered why. I'd seen that exact brushwork once before, in a training seminar years earlier, a slide on regional Midwest painters whose work occasionally turns up misattributed or unsigned in estate sales because nobody thought to look twice at what was hanging in a hallway. I'd taken that seminar mostly because a colleague dragged me along on a slow week, 3 days in a hotel conference room outside Columbus, and I remember thinking at the time that half of what we covered would never come up in real work. I was wrong about that particular slide. I checked the corner of the frame. There it was, a signature, small, half hidden by the edge of the mat. Warren Delacroix. That family's painting sold for $11,000 at a regional auction 8 months later, once the attribution was confirmed by a colleague of mine who specializes in that period. I remember doing the math on my drive home that day, and then, a week after that, standing in my father's den, refilling his coffee and looking up at the painting over his desk. The one with the creek, the one I'd walked past my whole life without really seeing. Same hand, I was almost certain of it that day, and completely certain a year later once I cross-referenced it against an updated catalog a colleague sent me. My grandfather picked it up in 1946, not because he had any eye for art, but because an army buddy of his, dead broke and about to hitchhike west, traded it to him for a truck bed full of scrap lumber and $40 cash. The same $40 Renee would later use as a price sticker, without ever knowing that exact number had already changed hands once before, for the exact same painting 76 years earlier. Nobody in 3 generations of my family ever thought to ask a professional what it actually was. It moved from my grandfather's front hall to my father's den without anyone stopping to look closely, the kind of object that becomes furniture in people's minds simply by being present long enough. I never told him what I suspected. My father wasn't a man who wanted his furniture turned into numbers. He grew up during years when money in his house meant fear more often than comfort, and it left him with a permanent discomfort around anything that suggested his belongings were worth more than they looked. He liked that painting because his own father had liked it, because it had hung in his childhood bedroom before it hung in his den. And if I'd walked in and said, "Dad, this might be worth 6 figures," I don't think it would have made him happy. I think it would have made him nervous, the way money made him nervous his whole life. So I let it be a painting of a creek. I let it be his. I didn't know sitting there in 2019 that keeping that quiet out of respect for him was going to look, 3 years later, exactly like not knowing what I was talking about. Staying quiet out of love isn't the same as staying quiet out of ignorance. Renee was about to prove she couldn't tell the difference. Thursday night after the funeral, after Renee's kitchen speech, I sat at my father's dining room table with my laptop and a cup of the same coffee I used to make him, and looked up exactly one thing. What happens to a deceased person's property between the date they die and the date probate closes? I already knew the broad strokes from my own work. Estates freeze. Executors and agents under power of attorney lose most of their authority the moment the person they represented dies, because power of attorney dies with the person it's attached to, no matter what the paperwork says. What Mark had wasn't authority to sell my father's estate anymore. It was a piece of paper that had already expired the moment the funeral home picked up the phone, whether or not anyone in my family had gotten around to telling him that. I called the county probate clerk's office first thing Friday morning and got a woman named Linda Reyes, who'd clearly fielded this exact panic from 100 other people who just lost a parent to a sibling with a moving truck already rented. She had a calm, practiced way of talking that told me this wasn't rare, which somehow made it worse and better at the same time. She walked me through it in about 4 minutes. Any heir can file a formal objection to disposal of estate property pending appraisal. Once filed, nothing listed in that objection can legally change hands, sold, gifted, or otherwise disposed of until the court resolves it. She also explained something I hadn't considered. The freeze doesn't just cover the item itself, it covers any transaction connected to it. So even if someone had already shaken hands on an informal deal, the actual transfer happening after my objection was filed would be void, not just improper. People think once money changes hands, it's done. Linda told me it's not if the paperwork behind it was never valid to begin with. You'd be surprised how many families never find out this option exists, she said, until it's already too late to use it. I didn't tell her I might have been one of them if I did something other than this for a living. I asked her almost as an afterthought whether the timing mattered, whether 4 days was enough runway to actually get something filed and processed before Saturday. People have done it in less, she said. The system doesn't care how much notice you had. It only cares whether you used the option while it was still available to you. I didn't scream at Mark over the phone that morning, though I thought about it. I filled out a form instead. I listed the painting by description and location, attached 2 photographs I'd taken of the signature months earlier without ever telling anyone why. I e-filed it at 9:14 a.m., and Linda confirmed receipt by 9:20, faster than I expected for a Friday. Saturday's estate sale went ahead exactly as planned, 4 days after our father's funeral. Cars lined up down the block by 9 in the morning. People picking through his winter coats and his good dishes like it was any other Saturday. Every table in that yard sold out by noon. The painting stayed on the wall. Filing a piece of paper isn't dramatic. It's the least dramatic thing you can do, and it's the only thing that actually works. Saturday, 9 in the morning, cars already lined up down my father's street. more of them than I expected for a town this size. Renee had the whole yard covered in folding tables by the time I got there. Everything from his tool shed to his winter coats laid out under handwritten signs. A woman I didn't recognize haggling over a set of hand tools that had belonged to my grandfather. Someone else's kids running through the side yard while their mother dug through a box of Dad's old records. The whole thing had the strange, hollow energy of a garage sale layered directly on top of a funeral, both happening in the same 300 square feet of grass. The den stayed roped off with a strip of yellow caution tape Renee must have found in the garage. My objection printed and taped to the door, which she walked past 4 separate times that morning without once looking at it directly. What I didn't expect was the truck. My father's 1967 pickup, the one he'd kept running himself for 40 years and never once sold, even when the transmission needed replacing twice, sat in the driveway with a for sale sign taped to the windshield and Mark leaning against the tailgate talking to a man I didn't recognize. I stood there a second longer than I should have before I understood what I was looking at. "You can't sell that," I said, and Mark straightened up like I'd caught him at something, which I had. "It's not for sale, I'm figuring out what it's worth," he said, which didn't match the sign taped to the windshield and didn't match the man beside him who was already pulling out his phone to photograph the odometer. Mark hadn't filed anything, hadn't asked anyone, hadn't mentioned it at the funeral or the kitchen conversation or anywhere else. He just started the paperwork to title it into his own name 2 days earlier. The same Thursday, I filed my objection on the painting, like he'd been running his own separate clock the whole time, quietly in a different room. I didn't know the truck's value off the top of my head the way I knew the paintings. I handle vehicles occasionally, mostly for estate work, and a restored 67 in that condition, original engine, low miles for its age, runs anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000 depending on the buyer and the market that year. Mark had a cash offer on the hood of that truck for $6,000 from a man he worked with who wanted a project and didn't know or care what he was actually looking at. So if anyone watching this has ever had a sibling quietly move on something before the will was even read, tell me what it was in the comments. And if you want to see how deep this family's list of things nobody thought I'd notice actually went, hit subscribe because it kept going. I walked back into the house, printed a second objection form off my father's home printer while Renee's yard sale kept going outside the window, and added the truck to it by description and vehicle identification number, which I still had memorized from the years I'd insured it for him after his own agent retired. Mark found me at the printer. "This is insane," he said. "It's a truck, Carol. It's not a painting." I told him a court in this state doesn't care what kind of property it is, only whether somebody tried to move it before probate closed. He didn't have anything to say to that. 1, quiet transfer isn't an accident. 2, 4 days apart is a pattern with a name. The call from Dennis came in around 11 that same Saturday morning, while I was still standing in the driveway with the truck's new objection form folded in my back pocket. I'd met Dennis exactly once, 11 years earlier, across a folding table at an estate auction 2 towns over, the kind of connection you forget about until it calls you back. He knew Renee from her book club and assumed, since I was the appraiser in the family, that I already knew about the arrangement he was calling to confirm. $800 cash that afternoon, once the sale wrapped and nobody with a clipboard was still walking the property. Informal, he called it, like the word made it something other than what it was. "I want to make sure the timing works for everybody," he said, and I let him get all the way through it before I told him the painting was under a formal probate objection now, filed 2 days earlier, and that any private sale, informal or otherwise, would be a felony he'd be named in personally with his own name on the record. There was a long pause on the line. He got off the phone fast after that, and I never heard from him again. My Aunt Barbara, my father's younger sister, showed up around noon with my cousin Dana, both of them expecting a normal estate sale and a family saying goodbye together over folding tables and old dish towels. Instead, they found me standing in the driveway holding 2 objection forms while Renee told anyone who'd listen that I was making a scene over things nobody even liked. That grief did strange things to people, that I'd always been the dramatic one. Barbara didn't take a side that first day. She just watched, arms crossed, the way people do when they're trying to figure out which version of events is the real one and which one is performance. Dana stayed close to Renee most of the afternoon, which I noticed and didn't say anything about. Dana found me alone by my car as I was leaving that afternoon. She didn't say much, just asked, quietly, whether I actually thought Mark and Renee had planned this before Dad even died, or whether it had come together after in the scramble of the week. I told her I didn't know yet and that I was trying not to guess before I had an answer, which was true at the time, even if it stopped being true a few weeks later. I didn't argue with Renee in front of everyone. I found a quiet minute with Barbara by the fence line, away from the tables, and handed her a copy of the truck's registration with the VIN circled in red pen. I asked her straight out if she remembered Dad ever mentioning wanting Mark specifically to have it, over anyone else, over splitting its value evenly. She thought about it longer than I expected. No, she finally said. He never said that to me. That was the whole conversation. It was enough to plant something that would take root over the following weeks. Somewhere in the middle of all that, I watched a stranger buy my father's entire fishing tackle box, 40 years of lures and hand-tied flies he'd made himself on winter evenings for $6 because nobody had thought to separate what he'd made from what he'd just bought. I didn't stop that sale. Some things you can only fight for one at a time, and I'd already picked mine. A family gathering isn't proof everyone's on the same side. Sometimes it's just the first time everyone's in the same room to find out they aren't. The next 3 weeks looked like a slow campaign, not a single fight, which somehow made it harder to defend against. Mark called twice, both times leading with how disappointed Dad would be, how I was turning a simple estate into a courtroom drama over a painting and an old truck. The second call, he brought up a summer from 30 years earlier when I'd supposedly gotten a bigger allowance than him, which had nothing to do with anything, and told me more about what this was really about than he probably meant to. Renee stopped calling me directly and started calling other relatives instead, the aunts and second cousins who hadn't been in that driveway to see any of it firsthand, feeding them a version where I'd shown up after 2 years of barely helping and tried to grab everything for myself the moment Dad was gone. My cousin Kevin, Barbara's son, called me himself one evening, repeating almost word for word a version Renee had apparently given him at a birthday party that weekend, that I'd hired some appraiser friend to inflate a painting's value out of spite. I told him the appraiser hadn't been chosen by me at all, that the court had assigned her specifically, because neither side could pick their own, and I could hear him recalibrating in real time on the other end of the line. Renee's own mother called me too, a woman I'd always gotten along with well enough at holidays, and asked, gently, whether I'd consider just letting Mark have the truck at least, since he'd always loved that thing. I told her I loved my father too, and that loving something isn't the same as being entitled to take it before anyone had the chance to say otherwise. She didn't call again after that. I kept a folder, every text, every voicemail, every date, printed and dated by hand in the margin. Not because I planned to use it as ammunition, at least not at first, but because 30 years of appraisal work teaches you that memory is the least reliable evidence in any dispute, and paper is the only kind that holds up when two people remember the same conversation differently. Renee tried one more thing in that stretch. She hired her own appraiser, a man she found through a friend of a friend, who came out to the house on a weekday when I wasn't there and valued the painting at $12,000, roughly what an unsigned decorative landscape from that era typically brings at a regional sale. I recognized his name from the report Renee's own attorney eventually had to disclose. He wasn't credentialed with any of the regional or national appraisal associations that carry real weight in probate court. He was a picture framer 2 towns over who did occasional side valuations for cash, no formal training in attribution. I didn't call him unqualified out loud, not yet, not to Renee's face. I sent his report and my own credentials, 30 years of continuing education certificates and association memberships, to Linda at the courthouse, and asked what happens procedurally when 2 conflicting appraisals show up in the same probate file. A pressure campaign isn't persuasion. It's what people do instead of admitting they're wrong, and it costs them something every single time, even when they don't notice the bill coming due. My attorney suggested mediation before we escalated further. A single afternoon with a retired judge acting as a neutral third party, mostly so nobody down the road could say we hadn't tried to resolve this ourselves first. We met in a conference room at the mediator's office, Mark and Renee on one side of a long table, me and my attorney on the other, the mediator somewhere in the middle asking careful, practiced questions designed to get people talking instead of posturing. It didn't work, not really, though I don't think anyone in that room actually expected it to. Mark opened by offering to split the painting's estimated value using Renee's framer's number, $12,000, 3 ways, which would have given me $4,000 for something already independently on track to be confirmed worth over $200,000. I said no. Renee said I was being unreasonable, that this was exactly the kind of behavior that tore families apart, that Dad would be ashamed of what I'd turned this into. I didn't raise my voice. I asked the mediator to note for the record that the offer on the table valued the estate's centerpiece asset at roughly 5% of what a credentialed appraiser was already documenting it at, and that I'd be glad to reconsider once the court-ordered appraisal came back, whatever number that turned out to be, high or low. The mediator, a retired family court judge named Harold Voss, said almost nothing the whole session beyond his opening instructions, but he caught my eye once, briefly, when Renee used the word unreasonable for the third time, and something in his expression told me he'd sat through this exact conversation more times than he could count, under different names, over different objects. Mark tried a different angle an hour in, said maybe we should just sell everything, split the cash, and be done with each other, which was the first honest thing either of them said all afternoon, even if he didn't seem to notice he'd said it. We left without an agreement. My attorney told me on the drive back that failed mediations happen more often than people expect, especially when one side is negotiating against a number they already suspect is wrong and hoping nobody proves it before they can cash out. Offering to split a lowball, number 3 ways, isn't compromise. It's asking everyone else to agree the theft was smaller than it was. The answer from Linda weeks earlier had been simple enough, even if the process behind it wasn't. When appraisals conflict in a contested estate, the court orders its own, from an appraiser neither party selects or pays directly, funded out of the estate itself before any distribution happens. That process took 5 weeks in total, partly because a Delacroix attribution isn't confirmed by looking at a signature alone. It gets confirmed by provenance research, and in this case, pigment analysis and a direct comparison against the artist's documented catalog held at a state university archive. The court's appraiser, a woman out of that university's art authentication program named Dr. Patel, spent 4 hours in my father's den alone with that painting before she said a word to anyone waiting outside. She photographed the frame, the canvas edges, the signature under raking light that showed brushstroke texture the naked eye missed entirely. She asked me how I'd first identified it, and I told her about the farmhouse in 2019, the training seminar, the 8 months I'd spent half convinced I was wrong before I let myself be sure of something that big. It turned out the same seminar had trained 2 of her own colleagues years before I took it. A small, strange bit of overlap that made the room feel a little less formal for the rest of the afternoon. Most people don't look twice at what's hanging over a desk, she told me before she left. That's usually the whole story with these. I thought about my father hearing that sentence and how it would have made him nervous instead of proud, and I was glad, in a strange way, that he never had to find out while he was alive. That provenance work included cross-referencing the auction record from the 2019 farmhouse sale, correspondence between Delacroix and a regional gallery from the 1950s, and a faded shipping label on the back of the frame that matched a framer's shop that had closed in 1962. Every piece of it lined up. None of it was the kind of thing you could see just by looking at a signature. The truck's independent appraisal took less time. 2 weeks, a mechanic and a classic vehicle specialist working together out of a shop that handled nothing but Preminus 1,970 American trucks. Going through original documentation Dad had kept in a folder in his workshop for 40 years. Oil change receipts going back to a Ford dealership that didn't exist anymore. A bill of sale from 1967 with his own father's signature witnessing it. Original engine confirmed by the block number. Frame free of the rust that usually kills these trucks by year 50, thanks to 4 decades of a garage he'd built specifically to keep it out of the weather. $38,000, that was the number, on the low end of restored condition given some interior wear, but real and documented, and nowhere near $6,000 in cash on a driveway to a man who wanted a weekend project. Renee's framer never got a call back from the court at all. His report simply wasn't weighted once a credentialed appraiser's was on file, and Renee's own attorney, when I heard about it later, reportedly told her as much before the hearing even happened. A number from someone with nothing to lose isn't an appraisal, it's a guess wearing a receipt. 6 weeks after the funeral, my attorney filed a request for Renee and Mark's relevant text messages as part of the hearing preparation. Estates in dispute can compel that kind of thing once there's already documented evidence of an attempted unauthorized sale, which by then there was twice over. What came back filled 11 pages. It included the full exchange with Dennis, timestamps included, arranging the informal handoff of the painting for $800 2 full days before the estate sale even happened, meaning the plan predated the sale itself by more than they'd ever admitted out loud. It included Mark's text to his coworker about the truck, agreeing on $6,000 cash before the title transfer paperwork was even signed, joking in one message about getting it done before anyone makes it complicated. And it included one text from Renee to my cousin Dana, sent the same week as the pressure campaign, that read, "She'll drop it once she realizes how much this is costing her in legal fees. She always backs down." I read that last one twice, sitting alone in my father's kitchen with my attorney's printout in front of me. I'd spent 30 years being the person in the room who stayed calm, who didn't raise her voice, who reconciled instead of reacted, and somewhere along the way that had gotten translated inside my own family into someone who'd fold under pressure if you just applied enough of it for long enough. I called a friend of mine that same night, a woman named Joyce I'd worked alongside for over a decade before I cut back my hours, someone who'd sat across from enough contested estates herself to know exactly what this kind of thing does to a person even when they're winning. I read her Renee's text out loud, and she was quiet for a second before she said something I've thought about since. "The ones who count on you folding," she said, "never actually know you. They know a version of you that's convenient for them." I didn't have anything to add to that. I just sat with it for a while, my father's kitchen quiet around me, and let it be true. I didn't feel vindicated reading Renee's text, not the way I expected to. I felt like I finally understood exactly what I'd been up against the whole time, which wasn't grief and wasn't an honest disagreement about what Dad would have wanted, and wasn't even really about the painting or the truck specifically. It was a bet placed early and confidently that I'd be too tired or too polite or too used to smoothing things over to see it all the way through. I called my attorney that evening and told her I wasn't interested in a settlement anymore, even though one had been floated informally the week before. $70,000 to make it go away quietly. My attorney laid out both paths plainly. Take the money, let it end there, avoid the cost and the stress and the uncertainty of a hearing where outcomes are never fully guaranteed no matter how strong the paperwork looks. Or push forward, knowing it could take months longer, knowing legal fees would keep accruing even if the court ultimately awarded them back. I sat with both options for exactly one night. I wanted the hearing. I wanted the number said out loud in a room on the record. A text message isn't just words. It's the one place people forget to perform for anybody, including the people they're talking about. My attorney and I got there 40 minutes early, the way she'd told me to, and sat in a hallway lined with the same kind of chairs from Dad's cardiologist's office, bolted to the floor, like every institution in the county had ordered from the same catalog. Mark and Renee arrived 20 minutes later with their own attorney. A young man who looked like this was one of his first contested probate hearings, and none of us acknowledged each other beyond a nod. The hearing was in a small courtroom on the 3rd floor, nothing like the ones on television, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and a docket taped to the door with 6 other cases listed above ours, none of which anyone in the hallway seemed to know or care about. Judge Ackefer had already read the file before we walked in. Both appraisals, the 11 pages of text messages, my objection forms filed the same week as each attempted sale, time-stamped and cross-referenced by my attorney into a timeline that laid the whole thing out in a single afternoon. She asked Mark directly why he'd begun red-idling the truck 2 days after his father's death without informing the estate or his sister. He said he'd assumed it wasn't a big deal, that Dad had always said the truck should go to whoever wanted to keep it running, and nobody wanted it more than he did. The judge asked if that was in writing anywhere, in a will, a letter, anything. It wasn't. She asked Renee about the $800 arrangement with Dennis. Renee said she'd priced the painting the same way she'd priced everything else in the house that week, based on what similar decorative items typically sold for at estate sales in the area. The judge read the text about the meeting time into the record herself, slowly, the one that named a dollar figure and a specific time 2 full days before any public sale had even started, and asked Renee to explain the gap between that and pricing it like everything else. Renee started to answer twice and stopped both times. Mark's coworker with the truck offer wasn't in the room, but his texts were printed and marked as an exhibit, agreeing to a price and a pickup time before the title transfer he'd claimed was still just paperwork had even been filed with the county. Closing arguments took another 20 minutes. My attorney walked the judge through the timeline one more time, the objection filed hours before an attempted sale, twice over, and a framer's report that had never once been submitted through proper channels. Mark and Renee's attorney argued mostly that this was a family matter that had gotten needlessly formal, that emotions had run high on all sides. Judge Ackeffer didn't seem moved by that and said as much before she moved to the ruling. The ruling took about 15 minutes to deliver, though it felt longer sitting there listening to it. Full estate value, including the painting at $214,000 and the truck at $38,000, split 3 ways evenly among Mark, Renee's claim through Mark, and me, exactly as our father's will specified before any private sale, cash handshake, or yellow price sticker got involved. The court also ordered Mark and Renee to cover my legal fees in full, given the documented pattern of attempting to dispose of estate property before probate closed. Mark didn't look at me on the way out. Renee did for about a second, and I couldn't tell if what was on her face was anger or something closer to embarrassment. I've decided since then it doesn't much matter which. A verdict isn't revenge. It's just the math finally getting done by someone who wasn't trying to lose. It's been 8 months now since that hearing, and I want to be honest about how this actually ended, because it isn't the kind of ending where everyone hugs it out in a driveway and the family group chat goes back to normal. Mark and I talk maybe twice a year now, mostly logistics, nothing like before, though there wasn't much like before to begin with if I'm honest with myself about those 4 holiday visits a year, and the phone calls that always ended the same way. Renee and I don't talk at all, and I've made my peace with that faster than I expected to. My Aunt Barbara calls me every Sunday now, which she never used to do, usually just to talk about nothing in particular, and I think we both understand what that phone call is actually about without either of us saying it. My cousin Dana sent me a long apology text a few months after the hearing, about repeating things Renee had told her without checking them first, about believing the version that was easier to believe. I read it twice before I answered. I believe she meant it. I kept the painting. The estate split accounted for its value in cash to Mark and Renee's side, rather than the physical piece changing hands, which my attorney worked out as part of the settlement terms. It hangs in my own den now, in a room with better light than my father's ever had, the creek at dusk. The same light that stopped me in a stranger's hallway back in 2019 before I understood what I was actually looking at. I look at it most mornings with my own coffee, the way he used to. My father's truck went to a restoration shop 2 towns over, the same kind of place that did its independent appraisal, and every few months I drive out just to see it up on the lift, getting the attention it should have gotten years ago instead of a $6,000 cash deal in a driveway to a man who wanted a weekend project. I used part of my share to do something my father would have actually recognized as him, rather than as me. I set up a small fund at the community college where he took night classes in his 30s, back when nobody in his family had ever gone past high school, for adult students studying anything hands-on, welding, auto repair, the kind of practical, unglamorous coursework nobody puts on a scholarship brochure because it doesn't photograph well. It's not big, it doesn't need to be. It's just there, doing what he would have wanted his money to do, quietly, without anyone counting it in a kitchen. If you're watching this because something similar is happening in your own family right now, the only thing I'd tell you is that quiet doesn't mean weak, and paperwork isn't the opposite of love. I loved my father the entire time I was filing objection forms against my own brother. Both things were true at once, and I've stopped feeling like I need to apologize for that. Some nights I still think about that Christmas Eve, Dad at my table saying he didn't blame anybody for anything. And I wonder now if he saw some version of this coming even then, in his own sideways way, without ever having the words for it directly. I'll never know for sure. That's the part of this that doesn't resolve as cleanly as a court ruling, and I've stopped expecting it to. Family doesn't fight over stuff. Renee was right about that, more right than she ever meant to be. I didn't fight. I let the law count it instead of her handwriting, and it turns out that was always going to be worth more than anything a yellow sticker could say. That's my story: a stalled estate sale, a signature nobody else recognized, a truck nobody else valued correctly, and a $214,000 answer to family doesn't fight over stuff. If a family member has ever tried to talk you out of something that was actually yours, tell me what happened in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe and drop a like. It genuinely helps this channel more than people realize.